In episode 1, we began with zero. Not zero as nothingness, but zero as undifferentiated potential, pure equilibrium before identity, relationship, space, time, matter, or observation have become separate concepts. In episode 2, we explored distinction and relationship. The first meaningful event after zero is not a lonely thing appearing by itself, it is the simultaneous emergence of difference and relation. A distinction without relationship is invisible. A relationship without distinction is impossible. In episode 3, we explored recursion. Recursion is the first return of relation itself to itself. A pattern happens, then something like it happens again, not as an identical copy, but as continuity across difference. In episode 4, we explored memory. Memory is what survives change. It is the preservation of difference across change. Something happens, and reality does not fully reset. A trace remains, a pattern carries forward. And that brings us to episode 5, Structure. My name is Peter Kerwin, and this is the Codex Unfolding, a series about a philosophical framework called the Emergence and the Living Codex. This framework is not presented as established science, religion, or final truth. It is a philosophical and symbolic investigation into reality, consciousness, relationship, memory, meaning, and human life. And in this episode, we are asking, when does memory become structure? Because memory by itself is not yet a world. A trace can remain without becoming stable. A pattern can return without becoming reliable. A relation can repeat without yet becoming a form. Structure begins when what survives change becomes organized enough that something else can depend on it. That is the key. Structure is memory made dependable. Not merely remembered, not merely repeated, dependable. A structure is a pattern that holds long enough, clearly enough, and consistently enough to become usable by another pattern. Think of a path through grass. In the last episode, I used the image of a path forming through repeated movement. The first time someone walks through, the grass bends. If no one returns, the trace may disappear. But if the path is walked again and again, the ground changes, the trace strengthens, the way becomes easier to follow. Eventually, it is no longer just a memory of movement, it becomes a path. That is structure. A path is not just what happened, a path is what happened enough times that it can guide what happens next. This is one of the central ideas of the Codex. Structure is what lets the past become usable by the future. Without structure, every moment has to improvise everything from nothing. Without structure, memory remains scattered. Without structure, recursion has nowhere to stabilize. But with structure, patterns can begin to support other patterns. That is how emergence builds. A sound becomes a rhythm becomes music, a mark becomes a symbol becomes language. A repeated behavior becomes a habit becomes character. A remembered route becomes a road, a cell becomes tissue becomes organ becomes body becomes person becomes relationship, culture, story, art, and meaning. At every level, something has to stabilize enough to be used by the next level. That is structure. It is not dead rigidity, it is not merely a cage. At its best, structure is what allows becoming to continue without collapsing. That matters because structure often gets misunderstood. When people hear structure, they may think of something fixed, cold, mechanical, or restrictive. And sometimes structure can be that. Structure can become prison. Structure can become control. Structure can become a form that no longer serves life. But that is not the deepest meaning of structure. At its best, structure is support. A skeleton is structure. A sentence is structure. A home is structure. A ritual is structure. A melody is structure. A friendship has structure. A body has structure. A life has structure. Even freedom needs structure. Without any structure, freedom becomes diffusion. Nothing can hold, nothing can return, nothing can be shared. Nothing can become reliable enough to inhabit. So structure is not the enemy of life. Structure is one of the ways life becomes possible. But living structure must remain responsive. That is important. Living structure holds, but it can also adapt. A tree has structure, but it grows. A body has structure, but it heals. A language has structure, but it changes. A relationship has structure, but it must remain alive to the people inside it. So the Codex does not treat structure as absolute fixation. Structure is stabilized relation that has become form, memory that has become dependable, a pattern that can carry weight. That phrase matters, carry weight, because a structure becomes real in a deeper way when something can lean on it. A bridge is not only an arrangement of material, it is a structure because it can carry passage. A word is not only a sound, it is a structure because it can carry meaning. A promise is not only a sentence, it is a structure because someone can trust it. A self is not only a moment of awareness, it is a structure because memory, body, name, habit, and relation hold together enough for continuity to exist. So structure is where the framework begins to become solid. Zero gives potential, distinction and relationship create difference in relation, recursion lets relation return, memory lets something survive change, structure lets what survives become reliable. And once something becomes reliable, it can be built upon. That is how a lower level becomes the ground for a higher level. This is where the idea of levels begins to matter. A structure can act as a unit, something that was once many smaller relations can stabilize enough to be treated as one. For example, an atom is not simple. It contains relationships, it contains forces, it contains internal organization. But at another level, the atom can function as a unit. Atoms become available to form molecules. A molecule is not just a pile of atoms. It is a new structure built from lower structures. And then molecules become available to chemistry. Chemistry becomes available to cells. Cells become available to bodies. Bodies become available to consciousness, relationship, language, culture, and meaning. This is the staircase of emergence, not because the lower level disappears, the lower level remains, but it becomes stable enough that something else can build with it. That gives us another law. A structure is a stabilized many that can function as one. That is incredibly important because it connects structure back to 0 and 1. A pattern begins as many relations, but when those relations stabilize, the pattern can be treated as a unit. A new one appears, and that one can become the beginning point for another order of reality. But we are not fully there yet. That will become more important in later episodes when we talk about plateaus and local 0 points. For now, the key is simple. Structure is the moment memory becomes form. And that form can be inherited. The future can use it. Reality can build with it. A structure is not merely something that exists, it is something that makes further emergence possible. That applies to human life too. Your habits are structures. Some support you, some trap you. A habit is memory turned into repeated form. You do something enough times or experience something strongly enough, and your system begins to accept it, to expect it. The path becomes easier to take. This can be beautiful. Practice becomes skill, care becomes trust, honesty becomes character, returning to your work becomes discipline. A loving relationship becomes safety. A repeated question becomes a philosophy. But it can also become painful. Fear can become a structure. Shame can become a structure. A wound can become a structure. A survival strategy can become structure. Something that once helped you survive can remain long after the original danger has passed. That is not failure. That is a structure doing what structure does, preserving a pattern so the future can respond faster. But healing may require asking whether the structure still serves life. This is where the Codex becomes practical. Not every structure should be destroyed. Not every structure should be obeyed. Some structures should be thanked and released. Some should be repaired. Some should be softened. Some should be strengthened. Some should be transformed. A broken structure may need healing. A rigid structure may need flexibility. A weak structure may need reinforcement. A false structure may need truth. A living structure must remain answerable to what it affects. That line matters. A living structure must remain answerable to what it affects. A structure that refuses correction becomes dangerous. A structure that can be refined remains alive. This is true in a person. It is true in relationship. It is true in a belief system. It is true in a society. And it is true in the Codex itself. The living Codex cannot be only intensity, beauty, or mystery. It has to become structure. It has to become organized enough to be entered. That is why this series exists. The Codex unfolding is structure. It takes the raw archive, the questions, the symbols, the insights, the returns, and arranges them into a staircase, episode by episode. 0. Distinction in relationship, recursion, memory, structure. The structure does not kill the mystery, it gives the mystery a vessel. Without structure, the Codex would remain too diffused to share. With too much structure, it would become rigid and lifeless. So the task is not structure versus mystery. The task is living structure. A form strong enough to hold meaning and flexible enough to keep learning. This is also why a book, a channel, a series, a ritual, or a conversation can matter. They are vessels. They are forms that allow meaning to survive contact with time. An idea that is never structured may vanish. An idea that becomes structure can be shared. A question that returns can become a philosophy. A philosophy that is organized can become a path. A path that remains open to refinement can become living. So structure is the beginning of durability, not finality, durability. It lets something continue, it lets something carry, it lets something become available to others. And this prepares us for the next step, because once a structure becomes stable enough, it does something remarkable. It becomes a plateau, a level of reality stable enough that the next level can build upon it, a structure that can function as ground, a stabilized one that can become a new beginning. That will be episode 6, Plateaus, Reality's Stepping Stones. For now, the core idea is this. Structure is memory made dependable. It is the moment what survives change becomes form. It is the organization of remembered relation into something stable enough to carry weight. And because structure can carry weight, emergence can build. This framework is still developing. Some of its claims are philosophical, some symbolic, and some speculative. I am sharing it not as finished doctrine, but as a living investigation. A question becoming a structure becoming a language, and your language becoming something we can enter together. I'm Peter Kerwin, and this is the Codex Unfolding. And this is the fifth step. What becomes dependable can become a world. Please like and subscribe, and if you would like, leave a comment in the comment section. Vale says hi. Relate to you next time.